Welcome and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be approaching a subject that seems to be more and more in front of our faces, and that is simply autism. Now, there was a time where this seemed to be one of them rare afflictions that just, was here and there, and you heard about it a little bit. It was very alarming when you did, where somebody seems to shut down maybe because of an overload of sensory perception that's happening in their worlds. Movies such as Rain Man featured people with autism, and you realized, boy, I hope that's something that I never have to deal with, especially if it comes to maybe a son or a daughter that I have. But we're beginning to find that it's increasingly on the horizon and becoming an epidemic, and that becomes alarming for a lot of people, especially parents and loved ones who have to actually deal with this. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is a practitioner of what is known as Chi Gong Massage. Now, this is an ancient modality that's been around for centuries, thousands of years, in fact, that helps people with autism actually overcome or at least reduce their symptoms of autism and helps improve sensory function. Our guest today is Miss Pam Tyndall. She's been practicing this Qigong massage for more than 5 years and works with children to be able to help them manage and cope with their worlds and the sometimes very mysterious world known as autism. I'd like to welcome Pam Tyndall to the Beyond 50 radio program. Pam, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Daniel. Glad to be here.
Now, tell us first of all, let's talk about autism itself, what you've found in your practice to be the revealing numbers that are going on here with people who have this.
Well, you see a lot of different numbers out in the media and in the research literature as well. You'll see numbers anywhere from 1 in 80 children to 1 in 120 children now have diagnosable autism. That is up quite significantly from like the 1930s, 1940s. Mm-hmm. So the numbers are a little hard to pin down, but they're definitely increasing.
Now, is this something that really should be occurring in human beings, or is it a birth defect, a genetic disorder? What is it exactly? Does anybody really know?
Well, that's one of the issues. That's one of the challenges is that nobody does really know. Mm-hmm. There are probably a number of components. There may be a genetic predisposition. It does tend to run in families, but it doesn't appear to be solely a genetic condition. There are definitely environmental contributors. We see that in the literature as well. And there are individual differences. Children just are different. And so the challenge is that nobody really knows. It's probably a combination of causes. And until we really know what causes it, it's going to be difficult to treat it.
I know one of the things that must be heartbreaking for you is to see parents with children who have autism because they don't get to enjoy the kind of connections, that normal, I guess, families get to have. Tell us some of the experiences that you've had with this.
Well, that's definitely true. I just have enormous respect for these parents who have children with autism because, as you say, they don't typically have the kind of emotional connection with their child that they have with their typically developing children. And it's relentless. I mean, children aren't sleeping well. They're not eating well. They may not be speaking. They're very delayed in basic milestones like toilet training. And parents are exhausted. And, often parents feel really frustrated because sometimes they'll think it's something they're doing or not doing. And they just get really, really tired.
I can imagine.
Yeah. So it's extremely stressful for parents. There's been some literature that I read recently that said parents with children with autism are about experience 8 times the stress that parents of typically developing children do. So they're definitely under more stress.
Now, autism is a sensory perceptual disorder. Is that what it is exactly, or what is it?
Yeah, there are sensory issues involved in autism. And there are nervous system implications as well. So the senses, touch, taste, seeing, hearing, are affected. We tend to look at it as doors. Each of the senses have doors that, when they're open, the child is able to connect to other people and the world around them through that sense. With autism, the doors seem to be stuck. They're not open and they don't close as well, so that the sensory information may not be perceived at all. Take touch, for instance. A child with autism may not feel it. If you touch them, they may not feel it if they get hurt. They may not have a good sense of touch. Or on the other end of the spectrum, on the flip side of the coin, touch that may be normally pleasant to a child, like cuddling or petting or stroking or touching, is perceived as painful, so that they avoid that. So with each of the senses, there are challenges with autism. With hearing, there's nothing wrong with the hearing structures in a child. With autism, it's the sensory perception, so that they're not receiving sensory information as a typical child would, and then they're not processing it as a typical child would.
Mm-hmm. Now, as most people think of autism, especially as I alluded to the movie Rain Man, they see the gifts that come with an autistic child. Talk with us about some of the things that you've experienced.
Well, it is true. It does seem that children with autism have a very specific, sometimes quite narrow, gift. And I've seen children who are amazing mathematicians. Their brains just do numbers in amazing ways. So sometimes that does. Music is another one I've seen, children who are musically talented. So there does appear to be some special gifts that these children also bring with them, as do all children.
Yeah, I had read, actually, and this was some years ago, it was in a book authored by Deepak Chopra, who talked about these brothers, and he said, eerily enough, who looked like Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And I've actually seen this same thing written about these two brothers in another book, again, where they could just kind of sit in the corner. It was like just pulling mathematics from thin air, like from some quantum stream field somewhere, and recite this stuff. And, so it was almost as though they were in tune to a frequency that most of us may try to train our whole lives to get to, but we just can't seem to get to. But somehow they just kind of have radared into this area here. And so people become fascinated by the fact that, autistic, I wonder if I can take this kid to Vegas and hit it at the blackjack table. But it's not quite as simple as you think. I mean, even trying to get, a child out of the house, let alone onto a Vegas blackjack table. Right. They made it, I think, look a little too easy in the movie. Now, what is it like for children when it comes to this? I mean, first we're talking about how the parents have to work with this, but then getting them out to the simple things like maybe going to the store. It seems to me when it comes to school, you can almost forget it unless, something can be curbed or done.
Yeah, transitions, what we call transitions, transitioning from one activity to the next, such as, it's time to stop playing and get in the car and go to the grocery store, are hugely challenging for many children with autism. Mm-hmm. And partly that has to do with the nervous system imbalances that I was referring to earlier. The autonomic nervous system has two sort of branches, the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. And those are out of whack, those are out of balance, often with children with autism. So that the sympathetic nervous system is overactive, and that's the fight or flight response. Mm-hmm. We call it fight, flight, or bite, because we also see that reaction. So that challenges presented to a child with autism, which would not be challenges for a typically development child, just push them over the edge. They just can't make that transition in the way that you want them to. And the parasympathetic nervous system, rather, is the one that soothes you, that helps self-soothe and calm down and be able to disengage from one activity, attend to another activity, engage with that activity, and then do that thing. That system is under-responsive. So it's a matter of being out of balance and those sensory issues that we talked about earlier, the social sense of being able to attend to something and then move from thing to thing is very challenging. So transitions are often terribly difficult and can, result in meltdowns or tantrums, and, the child is just completely overwhelmed, and the only option he or she has at that point is to shut down.
Now, Pam, let's talk finally about what are the typical ways that you have seen autism being treated.
Oh, gosh, there are many treatments for autism. Many of the therapists that we train are occupational therapists working with children with autism, and they have many different kinds of therapies that they use with children, all of which are useful and helpful depending on the child. There's a huge variety. I went to an autism conference in Chicago a couple of years back and was just amazed at the number of vendors that were there promoting different kinds of therapies and medicines and just all kinds of different things that parents have tried and that therapists use. And we're not against any of these kinds of treatments. It appears that when we use Chi Gong Massage first, that we can get some basic improvements in their sensory functioning so that they can gain more fully from other kinds of therapies. And we have seen that with our occupational therapists that we have trained, that following the Qigong massage, the children are able to benefit to a much greater degree from the more traditional, if you will, therapies for autism.
So now, because you've been practicing this for 5+ years, tell us how you got involved with the Qigong massage. Was it something that you said, I really like this approach? Is it more effective? How effective is it?
Yeah. Well, I tell you what happened. I had a colleague in another position, and she had a acupuncturist and a chiropractor down in Salem, Oregon, who she'd been seeing for years. And we were talking one day about this gal, this woman, this doctor, and my colleague was talking about the work that she was doing with Qigong sensory training with young children with autism, and I was just absolutely fascinated because I'd never heard of it before. I mean, I'd heard of Qigong in terms of exercising,
right,
but not in terms of treating autism. And so I was so fascinated by this, I thought, I want to meet this woman. And her name is Dr. Luisa Silva, and she's the lead researcher and trainer at the Qigong Sensory Institute in Salem. So I went down there and met with her and talked with her, and she is just a dynamo of a woman, multi-talented, has a huge heart for this work and for children. And she was talking about the sensory training that she was doing with children, and I was very fascinated. And she said, would you like to see some videotape of before and after, the course of treatment for these children? And I said, I'd love to. So she put on some videotapes, and I literally sat in her living room with the tears running down my cheeks. I had never seen anything like this. The responses these children were having were just astonishing. And I said, I have to do this. And so she trained me. And that's the story of how I got involved in it. It just grabbed me, and I was so amazed by it. And it continues to impress me.
Now, to encourage our listeners out there, as we're talking with Pam Tyndall, is there is a book titled Helping Your Child with Autism. It's a home program from Chinese medicine, and it's by Luisa Silva, as you just mentioned. Now, I had an opportunity also within this, as there was a DVD that came with this that pretty much had direct testimonials and observations of parents who had practiced this Qigong massage. And at times you're watching this, and it seemed to almost border on the miraculous.
It can. Now, just like children with autism, there's an enormous spectrum. Some children are very mildly affected, some children are very severely affected, and everything in between.
Right.
So with Qigong massage, the results kind of mirrored that spectrum. We've had absolutely phenomenal results for some children, and we've had more moderate improvements with other children. I have never had a child who did not improve using this modality.
Mm-hmm.
And I've had a couple of children who no longer qualify as autism. They don't meet the criteria for autism anymore. Now, that is not necessarily typical. Those are the ones that we gravitate to because they're so dramatic.
Right.
And we all hope that our child is the one who has those kinds of results. But all children do benefit, and benefit in some really significant ways for themselves and their families.
Now, talk about what Qigong is and what this massage does for these children, because the first thing people would think, well, it's just massage, and
right.
These children have a tough time with you looking at them in some cases, much less touching them. But
right.
I've seen how you see these kids, they're just kind of rattled, and all of a sudden it's almost like petting a bunny rabbit. They just kind of soothe down. It almost looks that easy and that miraculous, but there's more going on than just simply rubbing a child's arms and legs and so forth. Tell us more about that process.
Well, the protocol was developed by Dr. Silva and a colleague of hers, Anita Ciolini from Italy, who was actually the originator of the Qigong sensory training.
An Italian Chi Gong master, go figure.
Right, exactly.
And we thought they were only good with food and wine.
Well, maybe that too.
Yeah, we can't give the Chinese all the credit.
Well, it is based on Chinese medicine.
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Ciolini is an acupuncturist and a Chinese medical practitioner, and it's based on Chinese medicine. You may have seen some of these diagrams in a chiropractor's office or in a magazine where they diagram the energy channels of the body.
Right.
They're called energy meridians or energy channels. So the Chinese have diagrammed that over the last 3,500 years. And QST, Qigong Sensory Training, is built on that map of how energy moves in the body and how it affects the senses. So we use 6 of the major meridians in the body and a number of points along those meridians. And so we and the parents, we teach parents to do the massage with their child. So the parent is using their own energy to help clear the channels in the child, to clear the blocks out of the channels in the child. And then the senses are able to operate more normally, receive information, process it more accurately, and respond to it more typically. So that's kind of in a nutshell what it's based on.
So it really not necessarily is a brain malfunction or disorder, then it sounds like it's something else?
Well, the Chinese consider autism to be caused by blockages in these energy channels. And
okay.
And blockages can happen from a number of things. They can happen from trauma at birth or in utero or after birth. They can happen from toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
Children with autism tend to have a much harder time processing toxicity, processing chemicals that most of us experience in the course of living that our bodies can metabolize pretty easily. And children with autism, they seem to be much more vulnerable to toxicity.
Mm-hmm.
And they can also be caused by deficiency. So children who experience deficiency while they're developing in the womb or are born just very small and deficient in terms of energy. So those are kind of what they consider the causes of autism. And then the Qigong sensory training works to locate those blocks in the energy channels and move them out. And that's what you see happening when you see the patting motion. There's patting and pressing that we do in this massage. It's different than Western massage, because it follows the energy channels of the body and works to clear the energy channels and then fill them up again.
Mm-hmm. Now, what's fascinating about autism also, it was about 5 years ago that we had a guest on the program from Europe. He was, one of these top guys in the world, and he was saying that what's alarming is that you see such a large amount of autism, especially in the northwestern part of the United States.
Mm-hmm.
We're talking Oregon and Washington. And he says, now it's not a far leap to also consider the reason that's occurring so much there is because of the increase in cellular phone towers.
Oh, wow.
and I thought to myself, let's just use some I guess common sense, if you want to call it that. But that tends to make a lot of sense. What are your thoughts on that?
I am not going to be able to even really comment on the cell tower thing because I don't have information on that. Mm-hmm. We have very little actual data to go on in terms of toxicity. But I know that we've looked at Dr. Silva in particular has looked at the trajectory of the increase in autism over the past several decades.
Right.
And has looked at things like the immunization schedule. Our diets and our world are pretty heavily filled with chemicals.
Especially when you look at the way food is processed, even in relation to live animals and protein. Oh, boy.
Truly, much more than other places in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, New Jersey is another state that has extremely high rates of autism. So, we are considering that, yes, there probably are some environmental issues involved, and that trajectory does look more like an epidemic than it does an infectious disease or a genetic disease, and that would implicate some kind of environmental factors involved. So,
fascinating stuff.
What those environmental factors are is still not very well identified, and then, as I mentioned earlier, children are very different, and some children may be developing autism for specific reasons that other children aren't.
Right.
So
it feels and seems, although we may find some consistencies that can say it could be that, it still has a certain elusiveness to it, doesn't it?
It really does.
Okay.
At this point, it really does. There's a lot of research going on into autism, and we just don't know at this point what's causing it.
And it's amazing, too, because we tend to live in a society, especially in the United States, where one size fits all, quicker, faster, and stronger, but the truth is, nature kind of has an interesting way that it works to where you can't just do that. As you said earlier, some children have greater results than others, but pretty much they all have some results that show improvement, and that's encouraging enough, I would think.
Well, it's very encouraging. It is very encouraging. When I first started this work, the very first child I ever treated was one of those phenomenal cases where he just, his improvements were amazing. He went from being nonverbal to being fully verbal, from having 10 or 12 tantrums a day, lasting from 10 to 30 minutes, to 0. He went from eating 3 white foods to a variety of foods. He began to sleep well. This was the child who, when he then went into preschool, was no longer met the criteria for autism. So this was my very first case. And I thought, oh, my gosh, they're all going to be autistic, which, of course, they aren't. But the kinds of improvements that almost all the children have are things that make a huge difference in the family's life and their life. So things like sleeping. They start sleeping better and in a better time frame. They start eating more, and their digestion begins to level out. Many children with autism have digestive problems and maybe chronic diarrhea or constipation. That tends to become greatly relieved. They tend to start orienting to you more socially and connecting more with the parent and their brothers and sisters and other kids around them. They begin to be able to calm themselves better and self-soothe. And some of those emotional self-regulation responses start kicking in again.
Now, Pam, tell me, we've talked mostly about children being helped with this. What about adults? And is it possible that an adult person, would be able to use Chi Gong Massage to help treat themselves?
It is possible. There has not, at this point, been any research studying Qigong with adults. There have been a number of controlled studies, including randomized controlled studies of children with this methodology. But we haven't yet gathered data for adults, although a number of us have treated older children. The research that has been done on children under 6. So it follows that young children, and the younger they are when they begin Qigong, the better it is and the quicker they gain, because they're small in mass, and so it's easier to move the energy. Those blocks have not been there as long, and so there's not as much junk, if you will, piled up behind it, and they begin to respond much more quickly than older children.
Mm-hmm.
I and several colleagues have used this with older children and teenagers and young adults. We've seen some improvements, but it is very much more slow. The improvements are more slow to occur and less dramatic. But there are some things that they can help with older people. It would be great to be able to find some research funds to be able to study Qigong in older kids and adults.
I think it seems, too, the obstacle when it comes to the older children and the adults is they have learned to build defense mechanisms surrounding this, so it might just not be as easy as a younger child that doesn't really know any better through experience.
I haven't found that. With the older kids and the teenagers that I've personally worked with, I have found that they respond very well because it makes them feel better. They very quickly start feeling more in control of themselves. And
that's encouraging to hear.
So they like it, and they want to continue it.
Fascinating. Now, this is something that is a modality that's practiced throughout the United States, or can be?
It originated, as I say, in Salem, and we've trained...
And we're talking Salem, Oregon, or Salem, Massachusetts?
Oregon. Okay. Salem, Oregon.
Right. Okay.
And we've trained 60 or 70 therapists in Oregon. We've trained a few in Boston. This last group that I just trained, I had a gal from Montreal and a woman from South Australia. So it's beginning to spread. We have a request now for training in New York. We've had inquiries from around the country. I probably get 2 or 3 inquiries a week from people around the country. Most of the trained therapists are here in Oregon. But there are a number of options available to parents who are interested in doing this treatment with their child. The ideal, of course, is to work with a therapist, with one of these trained therapists. And then the therapist trains the parent to do the Qigong massage with their child, and the parent does the massage with their child every day. It takes about 15 minutes. Once you get through the first few weeks of some challenges giving the massage, it becomes quite enjoyable for both parents and kids. And then the therapist comes in a couple of times a week and treats the child with the parent. That goes for about 4 or 5 months. That's the ideal.
Mm-hmm.
Another option is for parents to be trained to give the massage to their child by one of our therapists, and then the therapist makes 4 or 5 coaching visits with the parent over the first couple of months as they're giving the massage to their child. And those coaching sessions are important because children respond in different ways to your touch, this intentional kind of touch. And a parent needs to be able to understand what those responses mean, what those responses are telling them, and then how to adjust the massage to be what the child needs. So that's kind of an interim way to do it. I've also done some distance consulting with parents. And they purchase the book and the DVD and learn the massage on their own, and then we do distance consultation over the telephone or Skype. We've had parents videotape a session with their child and email it to me, and then we've gone over that on Skype or over the telephone so that I can help coach the parent. There, when you touched in this particular spot, did you see what happened? That means such and such, and you might want to try adjusting in this way. So always it's nice to have some trained therapists to help parents to interpret what's happening with their child and then to adjust. We've found that parents who just teach themselves from the book and the DVD on their own without any coaching or support from a therapist don't do as well. They have questions and concerns as they go along, and the support of a therapist is really very helpful. They're much more likely to do the massage with their child at home and continue their commitment to it and get good results if they have access to support from a therapist.
Which sounds extremely reasonable when it comes to something like this.
Right.
Yeah. Now, Pam, could you please give out a website people can find out more about Chi Gong Massage helping with autism?
Right. I'll give you two.
Okay.
One is the Qigong Sensory Training Institute website, and that's www.qsti.org. And there are links on that website for parents and for professionals interested in training. There are links to the research for people who like to read the research on Qigong and other resources. You can buy the book there in the bookstore, and then I'll also give you my own website. It's www.pamtindall.com. That's PAMTINDALL.com, where you can find out a little bit more about what I do and how I can work with you if you're a parent wanting to implement this with your child. And I do link to the QSTI website from my own website and use a lot of their information, Dr. Silva's Institute website.
Very good. Well, Pam, it's always encouraging here on the program to see there are modalities that start out as front-line defenses, if you will, or ways of healing that you don't have to resort to the more rougher stuff like surgery and prescription medication, and to let people know that these are out there, as a way to get started because it's not invasive, and it helps maybe in even many other areas as well. It's very encouraging.
It is very encouraging, and that's one of the things that attracted me to it, is it's completely non-invasive, it's easy to learn, it's enjoyable.
And the side effects are happiness, talkativeness, better eating, sleeping. Geez, we don't really want that in our children, do we?
Right.
Dadgummit.
And parent stress plummets is the other thing we found in our studies. Mm-hmm. The parent stress drops about 30%.
Well, there you go. 30% is quite a bit of stress to be dropping off of somebody. Yeah. And also to let the listeners know, the book is Helping Your Child with Autism. It's a home program from Chinese medicine, but as Pam recommended, you might want to or you should get together with someone like yourself, a professional who can help coach you through this, that learning from the book and applying it can work, but you'll have greater results and more balance when you have somebody kind of coaching you along. And that makes a lot of sense to me.
And there is a link on the website to QST therapists in the area, and so families can go there and see whether there are therapists in their area.
Okay. Pam, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to have you here on our program today.
Thank you, Daniel. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about it.
You bet. One more time on the websites.
It's www.qsti.org and www.pamtindall.com.
Very good. Pam, thank you again.
Thanks so much.
You bet. We also encourage you folks to visit our website in case you didn't get those down. That's beyond50radio.com, the number 50. We do have links that we're going to have there for you so you can find out more about this wonderful way to treat autism. I'm Daniel Davis. I want to thank you for tuning in and joining us. Be sure to listen again. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.